Hey folks, welcome back. This is Tori's Top 10 for Chapter 6, the additional readings on human research. Number 8, what are some of the highlights from the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, and the Belmont Report? You should definitely read through these additional texts pretty carefully and have a good idea of some of the highlights, some of the main points being made by these texts in response to some of the historical issues that we have had with human research, both in the United States and beyond. So to touch on just a few of these, the Declaration of Helsinki states that in medical research on human subjects, considerations related to the well-being of the human subject should take precedence of the interests of science and society. The Nuremberg Code states that the experiment should be so conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. The Declaration of Helsinki states that it is the duty of the physician in medical research to protect the life, health, privacy, and dignity of the human subject. The Declaration of Helsinki also states that at the conclusion of the study, every patient entered into the study should be assured of access to the best proven prophylactic, diagnostic, and therapeutic methods identified by the study. These are just a few of the highlights that illustrate the importance of these documents to thinking seriously about some of the problematic ways that human research has been done in the past. Number 7, what are the human radiation experiments? The human radiation experiments are definitely a dark point in United States history concerning medical research. These occurred from 1944 until 1974. The historical context of the radiation experiments is that after World War II, the Atomic Energy Commission used facilities to produce radioisotopes for human experiments. This set the stage for what was to follow. Medical research merged with the government in terms of substantial government funding being used for medical research. Number 6, what are some of the key findings in the final report on the human radiation experiments? This report found that over 4,000 different human radiation experiments were sponsored by the US government between 1944 and 1974. This report came out from an advisory committee set up by President Clinton in 1994. This was an independent committee. 14 people on the committee were citizens of the United States, and 13 people on the committee were medical experts. Their duty was to uncover the history of radiation experiments between 1994 and 1974. Their task was to identify the important ethical and scientific standards for evaluating all of these events, and moreover, to make recommendations so that this didn't happen again. So the committee investigated a series of experiments, including the injection of plutonium into hospital patients by the same agencies that were responsible for developing nuclear weapons. They found that the types of experiments that had been done over those 30 years included plutonium and other atomic bomb materials, the Atomic Energy Commission's radioisotope distribution, non-therapeutic research on children, total body irradiation, research on prisoners, human experimentation in nuclear weapons testing, intentional releases of radiation, and the observation of uranium miners and Marshall Islands residents. So some of the key findings then were that during the thousands of government-sponsored experiments, the aims of those experiments were to advance biomedical science, to advance national defense interests, and to advance space exploration. So it was common in the 40s and 50s for physicians to use patients as subjects of research without their consent, and there was very little attention paid to whether or not there was any fairness in the selection process. So randomized trials were not common at that time. The committee also found that government officials are blameworthy for not having policies in place to protect research subjects, especially those subjects that were used while having no possibility of any direct medical benefits. For example, the experiments on children that had no possible therapeutic benefits. It couldn't have helped them at all. They were purely using the children to obtain medical knowledge without any concern for the children themselves as patients. They also found that the government conducted several hundred intentional releases of radiation into the environment for research purposes. This was not to study the effects on human beings, but rather to test weapons and equipment. They found that although it's unlikely that members of the public were directly harmed, the releases were done in secret, which is in itself problematic, and information about other human experiments were also kept secret. The advisory committee also found that with the research on miners, as a consequence of exposure to radon in uranium mines, hundreds of miners used as research subjects ended up dying of lung cancer. The level of radon was well in excess of levels that were known to be hazardous to miners. And in these experiments, the miners were not informed. The committee also found that in some instances, the secrecy prevented research subjects and their families from pursuing redress for wrongdoing. This was the case with the research on the miners. Because they weren't aware that these experiments were happening, they couldn't seek any kind of retribution or redress, or even seek any compensation to help them with the medical care. Number 5. What are some of the most important recommendations in the final report on human radiation experiments? Some of the important recommendations are that the government should offer personal, individualized apologies and financial compensation to subjects of human radiation experiments, and that all miners who develop lung cancer should receive compensation. The committee also recommended that efforts should be undertaken to ensure the centrality of ethics in experiments with human subjects. And public policy needs an active, open forum to clarify things like minimal risk, regulations on institutionalized children, and guidelines for research on less than fully competent adults. The committee also recommends that federal policies should be adopted on the following points. There should be federal policies on informed consent of all human subjects in medical experimentation. There should be federal policies on classified research involving human subjects that require the experiments being approved by an independent, non-governmental panel of experts and citizen representatives. There should be federal policies on environmental releases of hazardous substances. They must be approved by an independent, non-governmental panel of experts and citizen representatives. An appropriate agency, such as the Environmental Protection Agency, should maintain oversight of classified programs. Number 5, you should understand Hellman and Hellman's thesis in their text Of Mice But Not Men, Problems of the Randomized Clinical Trial. Hellman and Hellman argue that randomized clinical trials place physicians in an ethical bind. A physician has a duty to their patient to do what's in their patient's best interest to preserve their well-being. Whereas a researcher has a different duty. Their duty is the integrity of their research. Hellman and Hellman argue that they can't do both, thus the ethical bind. But why is there an ethical bind? Why is it that there's a conflict between a physician doing what's in the best interest of their patient and a researcher obtaining medical knowledge? So Hellman and Hellman argue that a physician's aim, based on their duty, is to make patients well, whereas a researcher's aim, based on their duty, is objective scientific knowledge. So some argue that randomization provides a check on physicians' beliefs and opinions, which are equally likely to be wrong or right. So some people would argue that physicians never know for certain, and they can't even have good knowledge to make recommendations on treatment without scientific knowledge, so there would be no real conflict. But Hellman and Hellman disagree. They argue for two specific points against this position. One point is that even if a physician's views or diagnoses and treatment recommendations are somewhat uncertain, they still have a duty to their individual patients to make that recommendation. So they should make their uncertainty known, but they still have an obligation to make a recommendation for what they believe is in their patient's best interest to treat them and make them well. A physician is giving their recommendation based on their current knowledge, as they should. Moreover, Hellman and Hellman argue that it might not be true that a physician's views are as likely to be wrong as right. They agree that clinical trials do in fact give us more objective knowledge, but that doesn't mean that having a lesser degree of certainty is a mere shot in the dark, that a physician has no idea about their recommendation. Physicians still have experiential knowledge that is important and that they ought to be basing their recommendations on. So a physician's recommendation need not be based on absolute certainty. How could it be? Science itself is never certain. Ultimately, Hellman and Hellman argue that trials are structures through randomization and blinding that guarantee objectivity, yet this requires a restriction of a physician's access to data. There's no way a physician can act in the patient's best interest. And ultimately, a physician should have the well-being of a patient in mind, not more objective medical knowledge. That's the aim of the researcher, but it is not the aim of the physician. It might also be argued that informed consent alleviates the physician of this ethical dilemma. However, according to the Hellmans, it's not consistent with a physician's role to suggest a treatment option where a patient signs away their rights to get good treatment or to be informed about the research data involved in the experiment that is related to their progress in order to take part in a medical experiment. So ultimately, the Hellmans argue that physicians are put in an ethical dilemma where recommending a patient to a clinical trial ultimately can put their patient at harm. So they take a kind of contra physicians recommending clinical trials view. Number 3, what is Friedman's thesis in A Response to a Purported Ethical Difficulty with Randomized Clinical Trials Involving Cancer Patients? Friedman argues that the right understanding of equipoise will show that randomized clinical studies are morally permissible. So he's arguing against the Hellmans' claim that there's a necessary ethical dilemma for physicians. So Friedman takes the pro position here that physician researchers do not violate duties to patients if they are in a state of equipoise, whereas the Hellmans take the contra position that even if physicians are uncertain about their recommendations, they have a duty to make those recommendations to their patients, and that directly conflicts with research through clinical trials. Of course, Friedman's argument depends completely on his definition of equipoise. So, number 2, how does Friedman define equipoise? For Friedman, equipoise is genuine disagreement in the medical community about a treatment's value due to a lack of evidence. So the important point here is that equipoise for Friedman is not genuine disagreement just for a physician as such, individually, but that there's genuine disagreement in the medical community about a given treatment's value, because we don't yet have enough evidence. Number 1, how does Friedman's definition of equipoise help support his position? So, given this definition of equipoise from Friedman, what can we infer about the debate over a physician's permissibility to recommend a clinical trial versus some other treatment? For Friedman, this infers that they are permitted to recommend clinical trials. There is no ethical dilemma, as Hellman and Hellman argue. But why? Even if equipoise exists, that is, even if there's disagreement in the medical community over a treatment, which there typically is, there's no moral dilemma for a physician, because the physician can still make a moral judgment based on the well-being of their patient. A patient's choice to take part in a clinical trial need not be coerced by unethical physicians. That just might be the best recommendation that a physician has for a patient. And it may not. So if a clinical trial is not the best recommendation for a physician to give their patient, then they shouldn't recommend the clinical trial. But if it is the best recommendation they have for their patient, then there's no ethical dilemma for Friedman. That's it. We made it. Make sure you have a good handle on these additional readings because these are really important aspects of human research.